a very seasoned bureaucrat from the Tamil Nadu cadre. Mr. Somanathan has, carried out various assignments during his illustrious career, and also his academic credentials, to say the least, are quite formidable. And to use a very popular phrase in the finance world, he's a tripler. He's a chartered accountant, he's a cost accountant, and also he's a company secretary. Besides his terrific academic credentials, Somanathan has also written copiously on various topics, and he's written a book on a subject which is certainly not for the faint-hearted. I think he's authored a book on derivatives, which is like something that, terrifies a lot of us here, at least me for sure. And it's our pleasure and privilege to have him here. Just a quick note on the structure. I would invite Dr. Somanathan to give a 5 to 10 minute introductory remarks on the theme that we have today, funding the national infrastructure pipeline. And then we have a distinguished moderators, both Pratap and Shubhada, joining in with a series of questions that we have lined up for Mr. Somanathan. So without much ado, I welcome on behalf of all of you, Dr. TV Somanathan, all yours. The stage is for you.
First of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to speak to all of you about the National Infrastructure Pipeline. I know that we are jointly hosting this, and we want as many people as possible to be interested in financing infrastructure, so it's a very welcome initiative. I thought that before I get into your core question of funding the National Infrastructure Pipeline, I might just say a few words about what is special about infrastructure in terms of its economic characteristic impact. Why is it different? Why can't it be funded the way that everything else is funded? So I don't want to be technical, but I would say there are at least two very important characteristics of infrastructure projects that distinguish them from most other projects in a modern economy. The first is most infrastructure projects, nearly all of them, have what in economic jargon can be called public goods effects. That is, that an infrastructure asset doesn't necessarily benefit only the user or the person who pays for it. It often has benefits and consequences for many others. So if you look at building a metro rail system, the financial returns to the metro undertaking are maybe insignificant. And the benefits of using the metro are not only to those who use the metro. If more people use the metro, people who use cars are benefited. They have done nothing to actually fund the metro or even use it, because congestion reduces on the roads. People who are building housing colonies are benefited because people are willing to buy houses that are further away because they can get to work quickly through public transport. So it's an example of how the social return to an infrastructure project, that is, the return or benefit to society, is often much higher than the return which is captured in the project itself. So what this means is that any attempt to estimate an internal rate of return or a net present value from the point of view of the project developer usually underestimates return on capital. So if you try to look at what's the NPV of the Chennai Metro Rail project, which I once headed, it's usually nowhere above 5%. Now at 5%, most people sitting in this discussion say it's not worth my time even talking about it. But the social returns are usually 19 to 29%. And that is why metro rail projects are built, not because they give a financial return of 5%. So this is very critical. It occurs in a wide range of infrastructure projects, including things like sewerage, where sewerage benefits are not just to the household that gets the sewerage connection. There's a big public health benefit to all others who otherwise suffer from contaminated water and open drains and so on. So the effects are very widespread. That's point number one. Point number two, most infrastructure projects have long gestation periods. So it is not that the project is necessarily non-viable in financial terms. It may in fact be even financially viable. But for you to reach that point of viability may take 10 years or 15 years in some cases. And most lenders and investors have a horizon that is much shorter than that. And they're not necessarily willing to embark on a project which is probably profitable, but where you won't see any income until year 15. That's too long a horizon for most investors in the private sector. Now, for both of these, in fact, I'd also want to take a small aside here. I think that if we had invented rigorous discounted cash flow techniques, then the Suez Canal in 1869 would probably never have been built. But if you now take an exposed view of the Suez Canal, it was worth building it in 1869. If you take all the returns from the Suez Canal since 1869, even if you discount them with an interest rate, the kind of traffic that goes through that canal today, its volume, its value, couldn't have been anticipated in the 60s. And if we had been very rigorous analysis, we wouldn't have built it, because I think it would have showed some kind of bad financial rate of return. And people would have said, why is the government subsidizing such, prestige projects somewhere far away in India? Why should the British government care, and so on? So, I mean, the point I'm making is infrastructure, one, almost always requires some kind of governmental intervention or support happen, even in a free market economy. And again, as an observation, I would challenge you to go around the world. You would find that most metro rail systems, just to come back to the metro rail, are in the public sector in all the capitalist countries. So it's an illustration of the point that the government's presence in infrastructure is almost inevitable. Second, a lot of infrastructure projects, I say this and it sounds very unscientific, but many infrastructure projects essentially involve in their last decision-making stage a leap of faith, an assumption that it will actually work, because not all of the variables can be captured in any kind of risk analysis or financial analysis. And what usually happens is that you retrofit the project to whatever criteria have been fixed, in terms of, if you have a hurdle rate of something, then you anticipate the outer year returns to be higher, or if there is something else to be done. But basically, you choose the projects based on primarily common sense and a little bit of financial analysis, rather than on any deep financial and economic analysis. Anybody who tells you the contrary is, I don't think that's true, because I've seen a lot of this over a long period of time. So it is against this background that we're looking at this national infrastructure pipeline. It's 110 lakh crores over 5 years. And what I just said is just to establish that it won't get done unless the government is a big player in that national infrastructure pipeline. And we in the Ministry of Finance are acutely conscious of that. So how do we look at funding this massive infrastructure outlay? So let me go over very quickly just the main sources that we see that would help fund this pipeline. The first is, of course, enhanced central public expenditure, central capital expenditure. We've taken the first step towards that this year with a much enhanced capital outlay in the central budget. On a budget to budget basis, it's a 35% increase, which is the largest, at least in the 21st century, maybe even for longer than that, not checked. So it signifies a commitment to provide Government of India resources for the construction of infrastructure in multiple ways. But it's an important signal that we think that a higher flow of government resources into infrastructure is essential. And we've actually committed this higher amount without reforming any of our subsidies. So we've not actually reduced food subsidy or fertilizer subsidy, other subsidies, and we've still enhanced this capital expenditure. It's, as I said, in a way, it's a leap of faith, because we believe that it needs to be done. And that's the way that we will get infrastructure development, which is critical to growth. The second source that we are looking at, and which has been mentioned in the budget, is enhanced capital expenditure by state governments. So here we have an indirect role to play. For example, in the current year, that is 2021, the central government announced a package of soft loans, 50-year interest-free loans to states for incurring capital expenditure. And 12,000 crore rupees was provided, and almost all of it is getting disbursed into actual capital projects of states. So that's direct incentivization. We are also looking at other methods. We may continue something of this kind into the next year, looking more widely at how to make state governments spend more on capital expenditure, particularly on infrastructure. The third source of funding for the infrastructure pipeline is the recycling of old public sector assets. That is, existing completed public sector projects, say in the national highways or in the railways or in other sectors of the economy, which are now essentially functioning assets. The attempt is to sell those assets to the private sector on some kind of transfer, receive lump sums in return for that, and use those lump sums to build new infrastructure, because it's new infrastructure which carries the highest risk, and that risk is better borne by either the government or one of its entities in the early years. But when it becomes a successful project, then the private sector is often willing to come in and take over the running of the asset. The fourth method by which we intend to fund the National Infrastructure Pipeline is by creating a new institutional structure for infrastructure finance, most importantly through the creation of the Development Finance Institution. So this would create an institutional setup where we have an organization that is focused on providing large quantities of finance to infrastructure, which is aware of its characteristics, which is there for the long run, which is prepared to wait and wait out the long gestation periods that I referred to. So the Development Finance Institution is the fourth important plank in the way we expect to finance this. The fifth is to encourage private capital to flow into infrastructure in a bigger way. So we already have what is called the National Infrastructure Investment Fund, NIIF. It has had some traction, but much more needs to be done. We have already initiated public partnerships in many areas, including the railways. We are looking at increasing the flow of pension and insurance money into infrastructure. Again, the new institutional framework, the DFI, will partly help, we hope, in getting private capital to infrastructure. And the proposed DFI law actually provides for the setting up of private DFIs as well, in addition to the public sector DFI, for which we are making an initial capital allocation of 20,000 crores in the 21-22 budget. Finally, we've also taken steps to stimulate the long-term bond market. In this budget, there's an announcement of a backstop facility for long-term bonds, which will sort of, the aim is to create a market-making institution which will provide liquidity to bonds other than government bonds. Government bonds are already pretty liquid, but the idea is to create, again, it's institution building where we hope that we can create a facility which will essentially be a market maker and provide liquidity to corporate and infrastructure bonds coming from outside the government. So in a sense, these are 6 ways by which we are trying to fund the infrastructure pipeline. Any uncertainties about how these will be implemented, I can only assure you that the government is very determined to make them succeed, and we will do whatever we can to fund the pipeline and the kind of infrastructure growth that the country needs in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Somanathan. That was an excellent perspective on the plan. I think, first of all, I must compliment the whole team for having done that so timely. I think infrastructure was the sweetest word we heard this budget, given the adversity and the kind of a acceleration that we needed in the economy. So my first question, Dr. Somanathan, before that, I'm Pratap Padode from Construction World. Is that you said that we have 35% increase in allocation for given the National Infrastructure Pipeline. I think the total difference was around 7 trillion, given that nearly over 21 trillion needed to be spent in FY21. Have we accounted for all of that within this 35% increase, or are there some unfinished sources that we need to tap?
Yeah. Yes. Now I'm unmuted. No, the government's provision in the budget is not sufficient to completely account for what is required on a year-to-year basis in the National Infrastructure Pipeline. The total funding will consist of government plus states plus private sector. That is central plus states plus private sector. This is broadly our proportion of it. But yes, more money will have to come from elsewhere, no doubt about it.
Shraddha, you can ask the next question.
Yes, Dr. Somanathan, one question to what you were alluding to is and states, and the government will have to do heavy lifting as far as the NIP is concerned, funding of the projects under NIP is concerned. Now, we do know that there are ongoing challenges, of course, from the private sector to get into the long-term financing of projects. And we also are aware that center and states provide the maximum buck to the bank to the buck, so to speak. We see that particularly centers expenditure on capex has 1.6 times larger multiplier compared to states capex, and centers capex has a larger multiplier on GDP by almost 7 times compared to the revenue expenditure. So the point I'm trying to make is we are completely aware that center states will have to do the heavy lifting, but the larger challenge, perhaps not as much from center, but states does emerge, because we have seen that until December 20, only the states, 17 key states have done a capex of only 34% of the budgeted amount. Obviously, there are funding challenges within the state governments. So how are we proposing to resolve this kind of a constraint, particularly when NIP projects are going to be extremely critical, starting with this particular fiscal year?
Yeah, I mean, incentivizing states to, I mentioned that in my opening remarks, but how exactly we do it, we have some thoughts on that. I don't think it may not be very proper of me to share it here first without having shared it with the states, but we are certainly looking at some kind of direct financial support, which we did, by the way, in 2021, because we knew that the states were heavily underspending on capital expenditure, which is why this 12,000 crore window was announced. You may say that that's a small amount. Yes, it is. But it was, again, a small amount on a small base. So I think what they would have spent without that would be much worse. So it was tied exclusively to capital expenditure. It was also tied to even settling bills on existing capital projects. So we were not necessarily giving it only for new projects, but we were willing to give it for stalled projects or even running projects where they have financial problems. So that was one method. That is something that could be continued. But we're also looking at ways of incentivizing the state to spend a larger proportion of its own budget on capital. Now, how do you do this incentivization is something that we have a few levers, we don't have too many, and we are mindful of the autonomy of the states. Everybody wants state autonomy except when you don't like it. So we all want states to be given GST money unconditionally without any this thing, but we also want them to spend more on capital expenditure. So we continuously face these challenges of the differing demands of different commentators, and sometimes the same commentator at different times. So it's so we are looking at what we can do, which is appropriate, but we do realize that something needs to be done about it. You should excuse me for not being specific.
Dr. Somnathan, since we are also looking at foreign capital via sovereign wealth funds, etc., to finance infrastructure, and these funds typically look at something which is at least more than AA in terms of rating, and most of our infrastructure projects are below AA. So it is critical to enhance the rating to augment the access of these institutional investors. What can be done about that?
Yeah, I think the new development finance institution, one of its areas of operation would be on credit enhancement, is my sort of conjecture that, again, we are willing to put some government money behind these initiatives. So if you have a project that is low rated, then we can upgrade the rating with a little bit of sovereign help in terms of, first losses or some kind of guarantees or some backup from either state or central government. So that's an important aspect if it's an investment in a project. The other way is, of course, that you use an intermediary to channel the private funds, where the private funds don't go into a low-rated institution, but they come into a higher-rated institution. The higher-rated institution makes some of its investments in lower-rated institutions. So these are some of the ways that we would work on it. And I think the new institution is going to be important in accomplishing these things.
The other area which has probably not been accounted for in NIP, as I assume, is the unfinished or abandoned or stuck projects. And so is there any, because in the medium term, if we have to accelerate growth with lower gestation, these would be the projects that may need funding. Have we have we this in mind in terms of creating this acceleration? Maybe we thought deploy an infra Nirbhar projects mission director on the lines of what had been done during the stuck projects time previously, who can target these projects and get them to fruition. What is your view?
Yeah. I think there are two kinds of stalled or stuck projects. The ones that are purely government projects, we actually have a system currently called Pragati, which is actually chaired by the Prime Minister himself, which is actually more effective than the old stuck projects initiative, because this actually, nobody wants to go before the Prime Minister and say that I've been taking 6 months not to clear something. And that works pretty well on the pure government and pure public sector projects. The problem we have is with things like private power projects or projects that have a private element and also some public interface, which are stalled. I think you are right that there is certainly some scope for better coordination from the government side. If it involves public agencies, state government, clearances, environment, forests, land acquisition. But in the projects that don't have too much public interface, we have a lot of those too. And those are mostly stuck in things like the NCLT. And here I actually think it's the new initiative on the so-called bad bank that might really help more than even any mission director, because the mission director I think would be helpful where the problem is largely government, where the problem is that the state government is suddenly withdrawn, or the environment ministry is not giving a clearance, or some land acquisition is not happening, the quarry permit is not being given, all of which are common problems. Those can be helped through an administrative support. But if you have a project that is stuck because of solvency issues, then it becomes more of a financial resolution. And for financial resolution, the delays are often because we have 10 banks, 9 of them agree, 1 doesn't, and so the NCLT can't pass a consent order. So these kinds of issues I think will be helped by the new structure of a bad bank. But I think there is merit in what you're saying in terms of a stronger administrative push to resolve these projects.
Dr. Somnathan, one of the biggest challenges that we have seen is that the project pipeline has weakened over the last few years. And in order to strengthen this pipeline, some sort of a bank of bankable projects needs to be created. Like, for example, out of 110 trillion, we've got 44 trillion under implementation, but other 66 trillion or so, they still need to get into the stream of DPRs, etc., in a phased manner, so that we have a good thick pipeline all through. And obviously, they will offer the opportunities to international investors and attract the private investors as well. But they ought to be full of clearances, fully incubated, which is where the challenge really lies. Any thoughts on how we can take care of that problem?
Each ministry, this is, by the way, this is one of those places where I can kind of shirk a bit and say it's not my, because I frankly can't do much about preparing the projects. We have thrown the gauntlet at them and said, look, there's this much available, including a reserve of 44,000 crores, which will go to whoever needs it first. So, which we've kept in the Department of Economic Affairs in this year's capital budget. But the point is very valid. I think we have had a lot of coordination efforts. The cabinet secretary has emphasized to all the ministries involved in infrastructure projects the importance of doing this kind of advanced preparation, preparation of these projects. They are engaged in this task. They've been asked to go out and identify all the clearances needed. It's an ongoing effort, but I can only say that the government is seized of it and is trying to expedite the preparation of those projects by the ministries and states. Sometimes it is states, some are ministries, some are actually state governments, where it needs to be done. But your point is valid. We are trying to do that. It's also the fact that many of these things are not merely questions of putting effort. So things like environmental clearances can sometimes come unstuck even with the most of effort, because if there's some local agitation or activism, maybe good or bad. I mean, I'm not commenting on the rightness of it, but it can actually become an exogenous force that throws the plan completely out of its timetable. And that can't be completely controlled by the government, however much effort we may put in. So we had that gas pipeline from Mangalore to Cochin, which took 6 years longer because a lot of people in 2 districts between in Kerala opposed the very construction of a pipeline. They said they don't want the pipeline, and it took years to resolve. So those are things where we had everything in place. All the clearances were there. The public didn't want the pipeline. You have a similar thing going on in Tamil Nadu. So I'm giving these as examples. My point is that you have to take these projects forward. It does need public support. They do need clearances which must come in accordance with the laws of the land. And not all of this is completely within government control, even though to outsiders it may appear that the government can get this done. So there will always be a little bit of slippage, but I fully recognize your point that we need to maximize our efforts to get all these projects fully prepared and ready to be constructed.
One question. Yeah.
Shubhada, you go ahead, Shubhada.
Yeah. Just one question, Dr. Somnathan. If I were to showcase the newly created DFI, how distinctly different would I position it versus the earlier created long-term institutions for infra?
First thing is, I would say the earlier, well, if you're talking long-term institutions for infrastructure, then you're probably talking about IIFCL.
Yeah.
If you are talking about IDBI, etc., they were not actually created for infrastructure. They were actually created for industrial project finance. So
no, IIFCL is what I would.
IIFCL, well, I think first, it's going to be much bigger in size than IIFCL. So I think scale is one important dimension in which it's going to be very different. Second, I think this is now part of a more integrated strategy where this is an institution that will aspire to create an infrastructure financing ecosystem in a way that, let's say, National Housing Bank has done for housing, or the NABARD has done for agriculture. It's not, if you like, it is not a Bank of Baroda, it's a NABARD. It's not a house.
Yeah, got it.
It is the National Housing Bank. So this new institution is more of an apex infrastructure financing, catalyzing, refinancing, and financing institution. So it has multiple roles. It may do direct financing, it may do refinance. It's got a very huge potential remit. Now you may ask me, when will you convert this potential into action? Well, give us some time.
No, the follow-up question is, does the IFCL then get subsumed with the 10,000 crore seed capital?
That is likely. No. There is 20,000 crores of capital is
20,000, yeah.
institution in the budget.
Yeah.
In addition, if IIFCL moves into it, which is very likely, then it will have that capital as well.
Okay. Sure. Thank you.
Dr. Somnathan, one last question. Asset monetization is going to play a very important part in gathering the revenue. And as you know, this is a very, very difficult subject in terms of, bringing it from all the public sector and then putting it together. And that's why it enjoys a sense of a little incredibility, if you so, from people. So we need to take care of that in the sense of actually demonstrating how this will be done in order to win that credibility back into this asset monetization program. And so also, of course, the divestment program. Of course, divestment program is more credible from that point of view. Asset monetization is more difficult. Your comments, please.
I fully agree with you that asset monetization is more difficult because, see, disinvestment we do through market-based share transactions where pricing is much more transparent. Asset sales of land or other assets don't have that level of market price discovery. And you know that we have a history in our country of prosecuting public servants who sell public assets. So public servants who sell public assets have to be conscious of that history. However, I think they also have to be conscious of the changes in law that have happened recently in the Prevention of Corruption Act, which in 2018 was amended to remove the section under which many honest public servants could be held guilty of corruption. Because what that old section had was that if you had taken a decision and someone had got a pecuniary gain without public interest, then the public servant might be guilty of corruption. There was no element of guilt or personal gain or bribe or nothing of the kind. That is no longer part of the statute book. So I think that's one. Second, you may note that in the budget speech, we referred to the creation of a new agency for disposing of government land, which we said would be managed on private sector lines. So precisely because we see these problems, we are attempting the creation of a new institutional structure, a land management agency of some kind, which, while being in the government, would be managed as if it is not in the government, maybe through a private sector, managerial arrangements. So that is the other way that we're planning to tackle it. And the third thing is, which I would say, is the mere fact that we are saying it is also important. We have not previously said privatize. We have said it now. So we are, that reflects a certain change. How important is that change? You may say that you are waiting for the action. Well, you're right to wait for the action, but we intend to act. So.
Thank you, Dr. Somnathan. I think it's been wonderful the way you have laid out the entire blueprint for the national infrastructure pipeline. And I think most of us are going to carry on this discussion forward. You've given us a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Somnathan. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Interacting.
Thank you.
Well, so I think Dr. Somnathan has given us a lot of food for thought, and he has virtually touched upon a lot of those issues which we all need to debate. And so let me start the question session. So Bharat, the first question to you, that do you think large volumes of foreign capital or sovereign wealth funds, as I asked Dr. Somnathan, do you think they would be willing to take this risk to come into India and invest that money for long-term infrastructure?
Sure. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Sure. So thanks a lot for having me here. In fact, if I could step back and say that not only foreign pension or insurance or sovereign wealth funds, why should even insurance in India or pension in India should not be investing? And that has been my continued conversation with the DFS whenever I go and meet them. And the common pushback which I get from them is that there is this big risk in the Indian infrastructure assets, which I actually beg to differ. In fact, I'll go one step further, having kind of wetted my hands and dirtied my legs on the ground. Is that Indian infrastructure assets, the way we constructed, the way regulatory regimes actually work, is actually one of the best assets for long-term investors. I would say that's very, very important to note, because you are able to lock in high yields over long duration and tenures, which unfortunately isn't available even in the government bonds, right? In terms of the way one could structure it. So the key issue here is that the long-term investors want butterflies and we give them caterpillars. That is the big challenge. It's not the asset. So people just confuse assets being bad, which in my view isn't the right understanding. And that's where I think domestic investor or foreign investor, both are smart investors. They are here for yield and getting the tenure right. Long-term investors want 30-year maturities. And we give them, 10-year government bonds, which has repricing risk, which has so much of other risks as well, which they are taking. But unfortunately, they don't have tenures and maturities of this size and magnitude, which is what we need to give them. But before that, why will this capital come, whether foreign or Indian? I think 4 things we need to get it right. And if we did, then actually this whole black spot on the infrastructure assets being bad, as it is said to me, will actually go away. The most important thing there is the governance bit, which is talked the least, but if in this ESG focused world, especially foreign investors, and I think it's applicable even for Indian investors, governance is going to be single most important thing which will separate men from the boys. And I'm not talking about the historical situations of thermal power plants and stuff like that. Yes, in fact, I saw a thermal power plant where a rail line was passing from the middle of the thermal power plant, which never ever happens. But it happened, it got financial closure, it got into construction mode, and then it got stuck in a situation. But people think, no, this is the things of the past, it doesn't happen anymore. It just happened 2 weeks back as well. Earlier it was thermal power, now it is renewables. That we have a situation here, just last month a bid happened on renewables, wherein NTPC said on their conference call that they submitted 3 bids and 2 of their bids never got opened. And a private guy kind of walked away with the bid. So foreign investor, very clearly, when we have this kind of government, governance basis, and then they invest in these kind of assets, which are in a way of negotiated bids, we are inflicting that risk of question marks being raised later on, and hence assets not meeting the ESG standards, and governance has become very, very important. So we have to get this governance right. If we can, then the capital will flow. Second is the structuring, that we have to match maturities and tenure as far as these assets are concerned. Just imagine, compared to giving a 10, 12 or a 15-year bank loan, which is what we typically have done for the last 20 years in the Indian infrastructure space, if we can match maturities of debt with the asset life. Just to give you that, for a 30-year toll roads, if the annual repayment is just 3%, just imagine how well the debt coverage ratios will be of that asset compared to putting in a 10-year bond or 12-year or even 15-year bond, right? So structuring is equally important, and that leads to defaults just because there is a mismatch on cash flows versus the maturities. Third is, don't inflict the risk which these guys can't take it, especially by the government or government agencies. And a classic case is, we don't have to go too far. Just last year, we had a toll ban, and none of the contractors got any compensation back. All of them got extension of concession. Well, my debt repayments are this year. My dividends to my infrastructure trust is this month or this quarter or this year. What will I do with the cash flow which comes like 30 years out? We all know this problem. It has consistently been coming. Yield investors don't pardon us, because they are, here is like, you have to play by rules of the game. If you are in the game and if you don't abide by this, and if you give them surprises on the yields, again, that asset class will not happen the way it should. And lastly, it is the hard work that we have to understand assets and cash flows, right? And again, here the same situation is there. This is the bond, but it's not a government bond. So you have to understand assets, structure it well, finance it well, build it well, and believe me, all the Indian pensioners as well will have hopefully a higher yield assets compared to this. So very clearly, foreign investors are looking forward to these 4 parameters to be there. And whenever they saw this kind of a parameter, they have taken very, very big bets, right? In terms of, and we have seen the amount of private infrastructure trust which has been set up. The one is with IRB itself, who is on the panel. Another one is CPPIB ones. And in fact, today, if you see, most of the real estate, the commercial real estate particularly, is already owned by the foreign investors. So they are out there for the yield with these parameters, and they will be there. So I expect tremendous demand. They are looking out for these kind of high yielding assets in a regulated system like India, a growth economy where there is an inherent growth baked in, and inflation hedge, which we provide. Like, for example, the tolls are inflation hedge, right? So in a way, you do not take the risk of interest cost kind of going up, because effectively it's WPI plus 300 basis points is what we get. So it's a phenomenal asset. It's apt asset for insurance and pensioners, whether Indian or foreign. And I see fantastic demand outside of India, Indian assets, as long as we take care of these 4 key enablers, so that we do not surprise that capital.
Right, Bharat. Thanks for elaborately explaining this. But that brings us to the missing block, the credit enhancement, which Dr. Somnathan also spoke about. So I want to direct this question to Mr. Palash Srivastava, that government has been pushing credit enhancement for drawing more bond funding into infra. So now this is also part of the national infrastructure pipeline plan that, so now that IIFCL is part of this DFC structure, what are these initiatives gathering momentum? Would you like to explain this?
Yeah, see, the credit enhancement, there was an earlier announcement, and I think we were associated with that as well. And so we would like to actually activate the National Institution for Credit Enhancement, which was already kind of approved. And there are certain things which, from a credit enhancement perspective, are going to be important, as was mentioned by Mr. Somanathan, that whether there is a certain first loss piece which is to be taken, or a guarantee which has to come through the credit enhancement. There is very little structured finance in the infrastructure space in that sense, because we do see, as we all understand, that there is in the initial stages, the construction risk may be taken in the Indian context by the banks, and from there on, it should actually move to the bonds. Now, if there has to be, say, issuance of bonds, there is, of course, it has been mentioned that there has to be a very deep and an active bond markets, which, of course, I think there has to be, as was also mentioned, that a certain matching of the asset maturities which have to come through. So as far as credit enhancement piece is concerned, whether it is taking a first loss on or muted returns on the particular, say, infrastructure portfolio, or whether it is taking basically it is the business plan is already with us, and all that will be actually put to good use. So so that's my response on that. In fact, I would actually, with your permission, actually do raise an interesting point on project pipeline, and I think that is an important thing which also needs to be really kind of focused on. That is what we would also like to play the role of a project accelerator, which actually not only leads to DPRs, but also certain coordination, clearances, convergence of a large number of things. So that I think when things actually come through, we will be possibly able to focus on that. And definitely the governance side of ESG. So at IIFCL, we have also got the green finance rating exercise, which is already also underway. So that will also help in credit enhancement. That we are right now working. We have already kind of worked on one project which has been rated, and if there is a such a pipeline, we are looking at least 3 more to be done quickly, so that then we are able to create a say a rated pipeline for infrastructure projects, and that will actually, as you rightly said, there is definitely a market for say, if you match the tenures, then insurance companies and pension funds to invest into Indian infrastructure, and we are trying to sort the governance side of it, and we would like to actually we understand that the pension funds and the insurance companies are very keen on seeing ESG compliance, and so we have readied a template which will also be rolled out.
Okay. Taking the same point forward to Mr. Suneet Maheshwari, so this creation of this development finance institution, how do you think the DFI can actually fill in the gaps, what we are talking about? And hopefully it does not remain yet to be fulfilled kind of a situation. As NIIF also, Dr. Somnathan said, needed to really work harder at this particular portion.
Okay, I think I want to address two things. Number one, I have been one of the few people who've been talking about DFI for a very long time. You see, one common thing we have to understand is that project financing is not banking. And I think, we are confusing in our minds between corporate financing, bond financing, and project financing. Project financing is a slightly different skill game, which has a slightly higher element of risk. And we therefore need to design the whole structure internally. Somewhere a few years back, maybe 20 years back, we had DFIs. And there was a science in creating those, or when ICICI was created in 1955, and IDBI was created later, IFCI was created in 1951. There was some method in that madness of creating it. And it was basically the bank financing, working capital financing, corporate financing would be done by banks. Project financing would be done by institutions. Somewhere we lost that identity. So clearly the fact that we intend to do something with respect to DFI, and we intend to have a new DFI law where we will have this institution as well as some more, I think it's a welcome sign. Having said that, I have a few things. I think one of you mentioned about if you look at the current government, there are enough DFIs within the government. You look at HUDCO, you look at PFC, you look at REC, and these are single asset financing institutions essentially, and therefore from a market dynamics point of view, they have higher risk. So essentially, therefore, needing government guarantee. What we probably need is 3 reasonable sized DFIs. Okay, and therefore there is, we may have this one because, to restructure the old ones takes, there is more pain and takes more time. But not only have we to do that, but we have to probably think, why does the government need separate institutions for each areas? If you have a DFI or a banking structure, you would have an annual result, you will have a quarterly result, and therefore you have to conform to those guarantees. If you want to create sector-specific credit enhancement organizations, you want to create funds, not limited companies. And this is one of the key problems that has not been understood. You talked about guarantee fund, and let me just explain to you that one of the key problems in the guarantee agency, this is where IDFC was also asked to do this and they realized that they can't do, is Reserve Bank of India's guidelines require the guarantor and the primary financier both to charge a certain spread. If you load both of them on a loan, they become unviable. However, the guarantee or credit enhancement requires an actuarial calculation, the probability of default, and therefore pricing that. Now, if you go to a credit rating agency, if they guarantee something, one notch guarantee is about 8 bits in cost, or maybe, so 2 notches goes up by say 15 to 16 bits. Some of this may have gone a little more because I think the probability of default, we as a nation have proved that we can do better than other part of the world. So we have a greater probability of default at the moment. Having said that, the point is that we think credit enhancement is like banking. Wrong. Credit enhancement is financial mathematics, actuarial science put onto project finance.
Yeah, you come over. I'm not born in person. I am in the office taking this on a VC.
No, so okay, I think he's speaking on that. Okay, so coming back, I think the DFI is a great thing. There's only one issue which I think in some other situation like the asset monetization situation, the government is wanting to draw private sector skills into it. And I wish that even with respect to the creation of this DFI, the government gets private sector skills. There are still some good private sector skills out there in the for project financing. After some time, I guess this will all dissipate and go away. But the point is, we need to find ways of getting project financing, and we need to get private sector skills in assessing project finance, and then create such an institution, tap into this knowledge. There's enough in the Indian market, and I'm sure we can do it. So clearly, when you start an institution, the key is who are the key people in the beginning. They lay the foundation. CRISIL is what it is because of Pradeep Shah. Anybody who says anything different is not realizing the real issue. So the key first persons are very important in creating the institution. And I hope the government chooses, there's enough talent, and that when they think of national initiatives, they don't think of only IS officers, but they think of also the whole pool of talent that the nation has, which is also there in private sector, to tap into that, to get both of them. You know, I have spoken to a lot of private sector guys who says, we would love to do something for the country. So it's a question of being able to tap them, but DFI is the right way to go, and Godspeed to them.
So I think the initiative to draw in private talent has already been done. We have some joint secretaries from the private sector now in the government, and maybe they should enlarge that pipeline a little more.
Yes, probably. No, I'm saying when it comes to having an institution, for example, the National Divestment Pipeline, we have people like Nimesh Kampani, we have other Vallabh Bansali. These are kind of now not very active in their current thing, but they have a good perspective. Can we find a way to tap these people in?
Sure. Valid. Coming to Dr. Shubhada Rao, so we spoke about a couple of areas where the government may falter in terms of its revenues, like the asset monetization or disinvestment. May not be disinvestment in the stock market as long as the stock markets hold until the government decides to disinvest. But which other segments therefore could be tapped, for sourcing funding for the government? Like now, state governments have begun, sort of borrowing as well. And you were mentioning that now we have seen that nearly 39 or 40% is going to come from the state and 39% from the center, only 22% from the private sector in this NIP. So your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think a very valid question, Pratap, is because two questions. One is this budget expenditure is significantly hinging on the success of divestment. Now, of course, the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen, government not being able to meet those targets. But in this forthcoming fiscal year, we expect government to hopefully meet this target simply on couple of assumptions that a lot of groundwork for the entities that have been identified for the current year has already got done in the previous year. Yes, equity market, the state of equity markets should, be supportive. But here I'm hoping that once the US stimulus gets announced of 1.9 trillion, which should be sometime soon in March or so, a fair amount of global liquidity will be available to, get channelized into promising markets like India's, for instance. Of course, execution of the disinvestment plan is the key, which has been all year long. But coming to a very specific point that you asked about what else can be garnered by the government. So obviously the budgetary resources will be a large part of funding requirement that will be needed, because over the last 2 years, we've seen CAPEX build up fairly significant. In fiscal 21, it overshot the budget estimates from 23 to 31% growth. And for the forthcoming year also, it is being budgeted at 26% growth for CAPEX capex of the central government. In my opinion, domestic savings are not going to be simply adequate for funding the infrastructure, and that is where the question comes of and it has got fairly significantly discussed in by the preceding speakers, that there is a requirement, there is a need for tapping long-term funding, not just domestic, as Bharat was saying, that yes, domestic are also eager to invest into, looking at the long-term locking of yields and better returns. But important would be the sovereign wealth funds and the pension funds, which would be looking at a long-term growth perspective coming out of India. Let's not forget, India is, of course, we have seen a much sharper cut in growth in the COVID year, but the ability of India to bounce back, we have seen many episodes, right from global financial crisis to the taper tantrum to now COVID. India has the ability to recover and bounce back. So that should be, taken up as an attractive point enough to be able to attract global capital into the country, because pure domestic savings are not going to be enough. LIC and long-term institutions are there, but pardon me for saying, but I think they are already getting overburdened, and we perhaps need newer avenues to get into the long-term financing of infrastructure, particularly designed along the NIP lines. So budgetary resources, global capital, that combination should work. And let's not forget, it's an allocation over 3 to 5 years. And if we get our design correct, we should be able to get that capital, exuding confidence to the global guys that we are here for policy predictability and so on. Mute.
Yeah, thanks, Shubhda. I think if Mr. Sudhir Hoshing is around, I don't see his video, but I was going to come to, the fact of asset monetization, Marat. I think what we are saying is, yes, we have lowest interest rates available. We have got liquidity, a flush everywhere. Funds are seeking growth avenues. They are looking for stable regimes. And in this whole quest for asset monetization, this can be the best time ever, actually, we can get our act together. Where do you see, how can this be actually done in terms of, so that we can draw good interest from the investors as such, so that the asset monetization program doesn't take so long as well, and it seems to be fairly unrisked or de-risked in terms of bringing in foreign investors. Bharat?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's a pertinent question. And while I do not want to discourage even the government, but I would like to suggest, just a one tweak, and it has got a phenomenal impact. I'll just give you example of this NHAI InvIT or a power grid InvIT, right? Which is what we are trying to do, and we are claiming this to be a great asset monetization. While I do not dispute NHAI situation, but if you just take power grid situation, this is like ticking the box. This is actually not doing an asset monetization, because why are we doing asset monetization? We are doing asset monetization to churn the capital and give the capital to somebody who actually wants it. But if you see in case of a power grid, the balance sheet is under levered. It's not that power grid has some 1 lakh crore backlog which they don't have funding to execute. It is also not a situation that power grid is selling assets market but is not finding any buyer, and hence this kind of InvIT structure is required to monetize it. I am all for asset monetization, but if I was given the mandate, I would actually monetize the state transmission assets, which are equally good, but it is the state utilities which actually wants that cash. It is that asset which is stuck out there, which nobody is willing to buy. If I could structure a state transmission asset into an infrastructure trust, maybe that will make sense, even if I don't want to sell it completely, but at least kind of monetize it via trust. So what I would say is that the model is fine, design is perfect, but what you apply this template on we as a country are taking sort of an easy way out by trying to, force in a way, if I can say, Power Grid to sell its assets when actually they do not want to sell assets and neither do they want that cash. They have actually a problem of growth kind of situation. So I think we should, the biggest missing link, if I have to say, is to find assets where there is lacking of capital. And biggest scarcity right now is not at the center, not at the private also, it is actually at the state sector. And we need capacity building. We need monetization at that level. And few of the states whom I speak to actually are pretty open about potentially monetizing, get the cash in, and probably spend that money on, say, maybe power distribution, and get their acts together on distribution where they don't have kind of money to spend and do the capex. So I would say the missing link actually is to apply the right template on the right situation, which will give the biggest bang for the buck. And I think that will do a lot of good to actually this funding gap, which you rightly highlighted.
So, what it appears to be that actually in the interest of agility, maybe the states ought to be made to be free in terms of making the moves on asset monetization by themselves, because they know their assets better. They have their own bureaucracy and hierarchies to look after, which will be distinct from the center to state kind of a situation. So in those areas where the states have autonomy, they can actually take those assets to the market while the world is awash with liquidity. Palash, what do you, on asset monetization, what are your views?
I in fact just wanted to update you on two initiatives that are on, precisely on the point that Bharat has made, and I'm glad Bharat and I have been able to kind of take a few points from Bharat forward. The first initiative is that at the state level, there is, of course, as was mentioned by Subhadra, that we have far more now financing buoyancy, especially in the southern states. There is a buoyancy. At IFCL, definitely on the road side, of course, state road development corporations, there has been a certain effort which has been initiated, and there is a lot of capacity building at the state level for creating InvIT-like structures, which is actually on the we are actually kind of progressing on doing that. The second is most of the states want investment managers who they can really kind of trust. So there has been a thinking, there have been some discussions in Niti Aayog also of a state promoted asset manager who can actually take up a lot of these things on asset monetization. So this time I would say thinking is very real, and very, very concrete steps are actually I don't think I'm at liberty to actually discuss a lot of things here, but there are certain things which are on the cards and on the anvil, which hopefully don't seem like what the example that was just now made about the PGCIL. But I think real asset monetization where real money is required.
So Suneet, I would like to address the same question to you, because you've seen it from the private sector angle. Also, this asset monetization program where you have to put together an SPV and let that roll into the marketplace. So given the government's whole baggage, how do you see that they can do a successful capital raise for this asset monetization program?
Actually, there is another. So first thing is that they need to prioritize. They need to talk to a few of the people who will be there on the investment side through appropriate market intermediaries to really assess some kind of prioritization as to which kind of assets are more easily accepted and which kind can be, need some more structuring. Because if all of it was to hit at one time, it's not as if it will lead to success. So there has to be some sequencing in terms of things which are clear, things which are easier, things where some more work needs to be done. So the most important thing with respect to asset monetization plan, I think, is sequencing, because the the investment pool that is available gets confidence if the sequence and the pipeline is set right. So I think, so for example, just to give you a highlight, if IDBI Bank's disinvestment happens better, in a much better planned way, the value that market will give to other bank disinvestments will be better. And I think that's what I'm trying to say. So first few good successful implementation will get you better response even later on. So I think that's one. The second, which I think we didn't delve on it too much, there is a huge pipeline, not of just stuck and projects, but projects where an arbitration award has been given, but it is now stuck in the some of the courts because somebody in the bureaucracy cannot accept. He's got, I mean, his mandate is that if there is a recourse available to Supreme Court, you've got to go up to Supreme Court. So what I'm trying to say is that this whole thing, the perspective that there are a lot of disputes of bills not being paid or things not being sorted out. I think we need to create a national clearinghouse to clear all this backlog. At least even if we can clear half of this, because a lot of money from the banks as well as that of the investors is stuck there. And I think if investors see old problems also getting solved, they get more confidence in committing more. So this, I think, and one thing will lead into another is my feeling that is there. I think the point which was pointed out, whether PGCIL really needs the money, and I have a slightly different take on it. PGCIL is a government concession. It got the right to create the electricity thing because of a central government right of way. The central government just could give it. So if PGCIL has a lot of money, they should pay dividends back to the government so that government can reduce debt. Public sector, 100% public sector, which was running on a central government largesse, should pay back the excess that they have over what they need to invest. The second part of the thing is very interesting. Yes, a lot needs to be done on the state, not just in power grid, but I mean in transmission, but in every other area. The whole problem is we need to understand this concurrent subject business and how it complicates, and with with a political system where there may be one government at the center and another government here. So all of this actually tends to complicate. So even if, let us say, an XYZ state has very good assets and they would get good value for it, they may just not want to monetize because there is a different government in the center and they feel there is a loss of power. So the point about this asset monetization is let central government and maybe a few other state governments lead the way. Rest will follow. We have to just make a beginning somewhere. I don't think we can expect a big bang happening in one shot, and that may not be desirable also.
Okay, before we go into discussing how can we attract private capital, I want to ask one question to Dr. Subhadra Rao. See, given our fiscal deficit swing that we are going to make, slingshot kind of a thing that we are going to do, where you stretched it too far and then we're going to come back with the prospects of good growth in the economy, we have two options: bring in debt or bring in equity from outside. Debt is at very low interest rate. Probably the way everybody is saying, we can get it at long term. We've already demonstrated that in bullet train projects and metro rail also. So on one hand, we may get desperate and sell equity. On the other, we may stick to debt, but then it has its own risks. What is the prudent way to do things now, given the situation?
No, I think equity would be a better, route and long-term option that we could look at as far as global capital to get invited is concerned, attracted is concerned, because quite clearly, if we are looking at particularly infrastructure projects, definitely you're looking at 10 to 10-year plus kind of a horizon. And that is where, in my opinion, equity would look more attractive as compared to debt. India is already grappling with, the higher debt component and the debt GDP ratio, and of course the looming concerns from the rating agencies and so on. In my opinion, as long as we provide policy predictability, consistency, and the ecosystem which enhances the confidence of the global players, I think equity any day is going to be a preferred route, both by the domestic government and, in my opinion, even the global players. So if we were to look at funding mix, of course, debt will be a part of it, but what do you lean on more? It's obviously, in our opinion, should be equity.
So in that case, the DFI, which is going to actually leverage on equity capital of the government and then raise funds from elsewhere, completely leveraging it, isn't that in a form we are actually going towards debt? And then they're funding actually most of our infra projects through debt. In a way, we are doing that rather than being able to create SPVs and sell equity of those to foreign companies.
So what's the question, Pratap?
So currently, doesn't it seem that we are actually veering towards raising more debt rather than
Debt,
equity? Because equity is only going to come when you divest.
Absolutely. No, I think initial part, obviously, with the government puts in seed capital, it should perhaps attract other like-minded countries to come in with some fresh capital requirements, the way it was designed earlier with AIIB, something like that kind of a structure. If we could look at some kind of equity participation, it would be perhaps a very well primary capital kind of base, which will then get a better leverage as well.
Suneet, you want to add something to that?
I think a part of that answer comes in. There's a huge appetite, as you may see, for what I would call as InvIT structures or REIT structures, which are essentially debt plus some equity returns. My sense is that we may not need to really be focused on saying one side or the other. The country could benefit. The cost of debt capital overseas is phenomenally lower. So if yes, there is a need to also get equity, I appreciate. So I don't think we should be so tied down about saying whether we want more debt or more equity. I think we need to create a very good pipeline of projects which are bankable and which are good. Once those are there, investors of all kinds find India pretty attractive, both debt as well as equity. And let them take whatever makes sense for them, as long as, because that will, both of them will actually benefit us. So I see no reason in saying we want to choose this or that. Our focus has to be to get our old house back into order with respect to old cases, stuck projects, etc. And the other is to create a good pipeline, we have a good sequence that is there. I think Pratap, Sudhir has come in, so you can ask your question.
Yeah. So, Mr. Oshing, I think you were the missing block, because as a private sector developer, I mean, in terms of a risk factor for long-term investment, you obviously are always needing long-term funds at low rates of interest. Currently, with the low interest rates that there are outside or globally, and there is so much of liquidity around, what is your strategy in terms of growth? Because you do have an appetite for risk, Indian risk at least, but what is your strategy for growth?
See, today the best options we have are for the refinancing thing or restructuring thing. So we are trying, we have tried, I think we have shown the way already to a lot of people. Our InvIT has, both the InvITs, which we did privately as well as the public. It makes a lot of sense for both the InvIT as well as whatever we could do with the dollar bond, which we recently did. That as early as last week. So refinancing, restructuring is a thing which you can actually do on the projects if you are giving good return and then churn the money, give it, then use the money for the other things. But the financing for original is only the project finance thing which we have as currently. Nothing else other than that. So that remains a question, and of course you are depending upon the same community all the time, and we have to we are always going to same banks, and that is also one way good because they have also now understood what are these projects about, what are the things to be seen, and they know their risk, we know our risk, and things are quite settling there as far as financing is concerned.
So, Mr. Oshing, still, the private capital currently is shy. I mean, and even though we are expecting 22% in the national infra pipeline, that's a huge, tall order of more than 2.2 trillion to be brought in from, private investors. So, what do you think should the government do to attract better private capital? So, what can be done? What is needed by the private developers?
See, what they have done is basically most of the projects, if I talk about road projects, so most of the projects are coming in HAM. So there your equity requirement is only 12 to 16%. So that way, and the risk are less. There also you get 10% mobilization advance, and then you can actually move that money, use that money, and slowly put on your equity, and that's how you can work on it. That's why I think the government is bringing those type of projects, and the number is coming to that 20% or whatever. Because the majorly projects are those. And if you talk about the BOT project, there are very few projects. But first two projects we were supposed to bid tomorrow. I think they have now been postponed till March of first March. So not many BOT, but they of course will come. They need to think what is happening there. If they can bring on BOT some project, they should. And after that, because what will happen is there will be different blocks of contractors or concessionaires. Those who can actually invest, say, 35% equity, those who can invest only 10%, and those who cannot invest, they will be coming into EPC. So those type of blocks they should know, and that is how they should bring in the projects. I think that's the way they have seen. I think that is how the things will move. You'll find 80% of the projects coming in HAM. So maximum projects, 70%, in fact, I can think will come in HAM. 20% EPC and 10% in BOT will come. That is how it will come, and that's how the number of equity will match.
So you say that financing is not an issue as long as you have a well-structured project.
Of course, I always say that. Yeah.
Okay. All right, Bharat, what do you say? How do you bring in private capital back into with animal spirits, as the finance minister says?
Yeah, I think as long as you keep kind of feeding that animal with a proper food, the animal will respond, right? But if you create trouble for that animal, then obviously animal will run away. So it's a very classic thing that we want them, but we don't play by the rules of the game, as I was suggesting earlier, right? Like all the toll road operators have just got a shock in terms of no compensation being given in cash, right, of the tolls which they have lost. Not many people speak on a public dais about it, but that's the reality, because investors who had made investment on those lines have not got the yield, right, precisely. So my request only is that don't change rules of the game in the middle. This simple thing, like, we are still debating on the land acquisition. We are still debating that 80 and 90% of the land should be in possession and paid for before even a concession is put to bid, I'm saying, because then the whole incentive to, meet the targets, and then we make that cardinal mistake of allocating a half-baked project, which is what has created the trouble, right? So I think these are simple things. I think all the conferences debate on this, we all recommend this, and then finally we don't do enough about it. But let us face it, that private capital has a choice. People have been surprised a lot more on the negative side. As long as we reduce that surprise, I think private capital will come thick and fast because they are not here for charity. But if they see healthy returns, they are the first guys not to come, I would suggest. So this is what government needs to do, is to give out concessions which are well baked, don't change rules of the game in the middle, and please consider the first P, which is the public. Because after allocating a concession, we forget the PPP ka first P, and then we focus that, okay, all the problems are of the private guy. That is, if we understand and appreciate, I think it will do a lot of good because, as you rightly said, 22% of the pipeline is private, though a lot of component is renewables there. So it is not so much of other infrastructure. It is still a lot of renewables. But even for renewables, if we did not fix our power sector ills, you think that this global capital will come and sort of to set up assets where the leaky pipe of distribution companies is there, which should not be able to service, in the first chance they get, they will back you down on renewables. They'll not make the payment. Average debtor days are upwards of 100 days right now for renewables. This is not something which is helping the Excel model really work on the ground. And that's why the negative. So just simply put, reduce the negative surprises and private capital will come thick and fast and give projects out which are bankable and implementable. That's the way I would really put it.
Sunit, what about the stuck projects? Like even Dr. Somnathan agreed that they have not provided for anything on the stuck projects as such in the whole planning of the NIP. Yet in the short run, those are the ones that might give us better benefit. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I think they are low-hanging fruits. They are implemented at a far more advanced level, and unlocking that capital makes sense, both from the banking system point of view, who probably made provisions there, and for the equity holders. So definitely, I remember in 2013-14 itself, when I was at L&T, we recommended to the Prime Minister's office to create an interministerial group in the CABSEC who will actually hear. So any private sector guy could actually take whatever his set of problems are to that forum and appeal that, look, I would like quick redressal of this. I think, one of the key problems that I see is it's not always a positive decision. It is a quick decision that is the most important. Maybe it is possible that at some times the government will say no, but the desire not to take a decision, because you are fear that it might be unpalatable, itself is not the right thing. So even if 50% of the cases get cleared by this some kind of a national clearing house, I think it's the best thing. And there is no other mechanism better than cabinet secretary, because you need to understand the confidential report of every bureaucrat is written by the cabinet secretary finally. It is in that office, no bureaucrat can actually duck giving an answer. So it has to be the CABSEC and an interministerial meeting there.
So the bad bank that Dr. Somnathan referred to may end up having a lot of these kind of projects from NCLT, which will be subject to some sort of other scrutiny and then revived. Is that?
See, the last bad bank that we actually planned, if some of you remember history, was RCEL.
Absolutely.
Okay, what happened of that? Today, Edelweiss ARC is bigger than RCEL. So, confused ownership and lack of direction, consistent direction, creates a problem. Creating institutions, we are very good in creating new things because it's nice to inaugurate. It's damn good, easy to become a Brahma. It's damn difficult to become a Vishnu.
Okay, I think we are nearing the end, so I'll just have last comments from each of the panelists on what do you think is the most important step for keeping the NIP, National Infrastructure Pipeline, on track, or providing finance for infrastructure. What are the first 2-3 things that you might want to say?
See, I think first thing is that they have made an announcement, they've made a commitment, and they've said
Yeah.
they want to do it. There is a lot to be done. They're not ducking it. I think when we heard Dr. Somanathan, it was refreshing to hear the candor. So the fact that we know where we are and we know the challenges of it is the first step. And I think we've crossed that first step.
What about you, Parash? Would you like to, what do you think is the most couple of important points that we need to keep in mind for this financing infrastructure? Oh, I think
Is that for me?
No, Shubhda, you go ahead because I think his picture was frozen.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
do I speak now?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
I
go
was
ahead, go ahead.
muted, so yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry. Okay, go ahead.
So I think, right. So I think the first 2-3 points, I think project acceleration is a very important thing. And I would agree a lot with what was actually said, that project acceleration not only means new DPRs being made, but also streamlining a lot of approvals and coordination issues. So one is not sure how it will pan out, but definitely a national infrastructure DFI would actually at least give a nodal position even in the states, and there is a definitive outreach to the states which is actually proposed, which is proposed. So I think a bigger and I think a more integrated, I think was the two words that were spoken of by Mr. Somnath. I think these are two important dimensions which we will have to actually look for. Asset monetization is a very important dimension which we will basically be looking at. So I think between these three, I would say, so first is project preparation. And aligned to this is project development as well, where we saw a lot of UMPP kind of constructs earlier, where there are ready, projects which are fully say made bankable, and all the risks have been allocated and managed in a concession framework. So that's the first point. The second point is definitely more integrated. So one doesn't know whether this will pan out as a state level bankers committee or a similar kind of a structure that as for coordination, but there is definitely a state level at least, and if not say the first 60 cities or that kind of a situation which is being looked at. And the third is definitely on asset monetization.
Okay. Shubhda?
I think while project identification, asset monetization can go on parallelly, but to me, the underlying key factor would be how best are we going to nudge the state governments, to get on to the spending on capex. And Dr. Somnathan spoke of incentivizing structures, getting planned out for the states. I think time is of essence. The sooner we get all the framework ready and up and running, quicker would be the time frame where we start implementing all this.
Mr. Hoshing? Oh, you're on mute, Mr. Hoshing. Yeah. No.
Now,
Yes, go ahead.
see, for me, the major thing would be, the project has to be bankable. All those things you have said is all okay. My final thing is whether you're going to see those projects are going to see the completion or the light of the day, because this is a very important point, because so many projects are coming and we have a lot of concessionaires or contractors who are doing these projects. But at what rate these projects are going? Nobody is checking that. I am doing at minus 20%, minus 25%, minus 15%, and HAM projects are going at a crazy rates. Those projects cannot be done at those rates practically. And those projects get banked also. I don't know how. And I don't know how NHI or whatever this authority, they give those projects. So why should this we have been asking for many years, that you should have some criteria of saying that below this I will not give, and that should be your internal number. That should not be known to others, because then that number will start coming. So that should be unknown number, which is only known to certain committee member, 2 or 3 people who approve those projects. Otherwise, what I have seen, somebody who has a 200 crore net worth or 150 crore net worth has today taken projects worth of 8,000 crores. 8,000 crores. The net worth is 200 crores. And you are depending on him to complete the project. Impossible. You are going to see 2014, you are going to see 2010, these projects will never be completed. I told this when the BOT projects were going crazy. That time I told member chairman that this is what going to happen. These projects will not be finishing. Then again we will be talking to Mr. Sunit and he will be saying what we should do about the projects which are there already and not seeing the light of the day. Why ask those questions and do the wrong today? So that's
Right.
my
So
thinking.
classic L1 situation and pre-qualifications, yeah? So Bharat, your last words.
Sure. No, thanks a lot. I'll take that as a privilege. To have heard all the wisdom and then probably summarize that if I can. But yeah, I think the most important thing or the missing link, if I can say, is that first of all, we need a 30-year plan for each and every sector. Because here is a situation where the national waterways wants to take away traffic from rail wants to take away traffic from road, and the expressway also wants to take away traffic from the national highway. Now, as an investor, frankly speaking, my foreign clients are thoroughly confused that what do these guys want? And, the guys have, auctioned like just 5 years back, this national highway in Rajasthan and in Gujarat and all of those places. And in 5 years' time, by the time they have not even finished, expressways are going to be ready and are going to compete. And our rules are such in concession that there is no way you can prove, because this is like 300 kilometers away. How are you going to prove this thing that this is a competing road? And just imagine the 30-year risk which we have taken. So I'm not taking just roads. I'm just saying for power, for transport, for every sector which is where you want to give a 30-year concession, government has to frame the rules that where the focus is going to be. Because for a minister, it's nice to say that, okay, now I'm going to decarbonize, and hence I'm promoting rail. The road concessionaires have invested billions of dollars, right? The first 30-year plan is very, very important. Second, do not change rules of the game, as I've been consistently saying. The third and the most important thing is actually the stress assets, which Sunit very rightly say. Somebody needs to do something about it, because I'm thoroughly worried that for the last 3 years, though banks may have written off thermal power plants, that doesn't mean anything. These are national assets on the ground. It is junking, and many of the bidders are now running away. Like last 2 months, we have seen 3 bidders actually ran away after putting in a successful bid just because for 18 months. Ooh. Now, these are national capital. The writing off doesn't mean anything. We have to preserve them. There is no national preservation authority. There is no guards. The scheme is junking there, nobody cares about it, just because I have written it off in my balance sheet, right? But as a nation, somebody in the cabinet secretariat or somewhere, somebody has to think on those lines and have a plan to revive. NCLT, unfortunately, has failed to a great extent, at least in the last 2 years, for one reason or another, so I will not blame anybody. But executive decisions will have to be taken, because these are national assets which are going waste. So I'm seriously worried.
True.
We can revive a lot of capital out of this stress asset itself to build the next set of assets if we can do well. So these are the 3 things I would suggest.
Wonderful. Excellent suggestions,
Excellent.
panelists. I think we've had a very wonderful discussion. I think we all feel geared enough to take on position with Dr. Somnathan's private secretariat to help him build the national infrastructure pipeline. Let's hope he looks at the private sector for that. So thank you very much. Pleasure having all of you. Thank you.